You wake up in the morning and for a few seconds everything seems normal, until that weight returns, that sensation of emptiness that settled in your chest and won't leave anymore, as if something fundamental had broken inside you, and now you're just pretending you still function. You look at your routine, at the things that used to have meaning, and now everything seems like an empty performance, an absurd theater where you're forced to keep playing a role that doesn't make any sense anymore. You get up, brush your teeth, go to work, talk to people, but there's an insurmountable distance between you and all of this, as if you were watching your own life from the outside, disconnected, anesthetized, silently asking yourself why you're still doing all this if none of it seems to truly matter. And the most frightening thing isn't even the emptiness itself, but the absolute loneliness of this experience, because when you try to explain it to someone, the words don't reach the depth of what you're feeling, and you realize you're completely alone in this existential desert where nothing has flavor, color, or purpose. There's something happening to you that's so deep and devastating, it completely dismantles the meaning of your existence. And Franz Kafka not only lived through this intensely, he mapped every inch of this psychological territory with surgical precision that will make you understand for the first time what's really happening. Kafka spent years of his life experiencing exactly this sensation, that life had lost all meaning, that he was trapped in an absurd existence where every gesture was a farce, every word was empty, every day was just another day of an incomprehensible condemnation. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what Kafka discovered about this collapse of meaning, why this is happening to you, what this means about who you really are, and most importantly, how to cross this desert without getting completely lost. Because Kafka found something in this emptiness that nobody told you about, something that can completely transform the way you see what you're living through right now. The first thing you need to understand is that this loss of meaning didn't happen suddenly. It was installing itself gradually, while you tried to meet expectations that were never really yours. While you built a life based on scripts that society handed you ready-made, without ever asking if this was what you truly wanted. Kafka lived this brutally in his relationship with his own father, Hermann Kafka, a domineering and pragmatic man who expected Franz to be strong, commercially successful, married, reproducing the model of masculinity and success that Hermann considered correct. Franz tried. He really tried to measure up, studied law even though he hated it, worked at an insurance company doing bureaucratic work that shattered his soul, got engaged 3 times trying to fit into the expected model of adult life. But each attempt to conform to what he should be only increased the abyss between who he really was and who he was trying to become. Kafka wrote in the famous letter to his father that he felt as if he were constantly being judged by an invisible tribunal where the rules changed all the time and he could never get it right, never be enough, never make sense of what was expected of him. And here's the first devastating insight. You didn't lose the meaning of life. You lost the meaning of a life that was never yours to begin with. What collapsed wasn't reality. It was the illusion that that borrowed script could one day become authentic. If you're feeling that nothing makes sense anymore, it's because your true being finally refused to keep pretending, refused to keep acting in a play where you didn't choose the role, didn't write the lines, and don't agree with the plot. Kafka spent years experiencing this dissociation between the authentic self and the performative self, between who he really was and who he needed to appear to be, and this division tore him apart inside, creating an existential void that he described as being torn apart by horses running in opposite directions. But here's what really happens, and what Kafka understood brilliantly through his most famous work: the metamorphosis. When meaning collapses, when you wake up one day and realize you can no longer pretend, can no longer fit in, can no longer play the expected role, you're not having a nervous breakdown, you're having a psychological metamorphosis. Gregor Samsa wakes up transformed into a monstrous insect, and the first thing he thinks about isn't his absurd transformation, but how he'll get to work on time, how he'll continue fulfilling his obligations, how he'll maintain appearances. Kafka is showing with surgical precision how we try to preserve external normality, even when internal reality has already completely collapsed, how we keep pretending to function even when something fundamental has broken. Gregor's metamorphosis is physical, But what Kafka is describing is a psychological metamorphosis that happens when you finally can no longer recognize yourself in the life you're living, when the mismatch between your authentic being and your constructed life becomes so great that something inside you simply gives up, refuses to continue, transforms into something that can no longer participate in that farce. And the family's reaction to Gregor is absolutely revealing. They don't worry about his suffering. They worry about the inconvenience it represents, about the fact that he can no longer work, can no longer fulfill his role as provider, can no longer maintain appearances. When you lose the meaning of life, when you collapse existentially, most people around you won't worry about what you're feeling. They'll worry about the fact that you're no longer functioning as expected. You're no longer available to perform your role in the collective theater of normality. Kafka is telling you something profound. This loss of meaning isn't a disease. It's a refusal. It's your psychological organism rejecting an inauthentic life. It's your soul saying, I can't anymore. I won't anymore. I can't continue like this. What seems to be the end is actually the beginning of something you can't yet name, but that Kafka mapped with absolute precision throughout his work. You know exactly what it feels like to wake up and not want to do anything that fills your days anymore. Not because you're lazy or depressed in the clinical sense, but because something deeper is happening, something that completely dismantles your ability to find purpose in everyday tasks. You're in the work meeting and realize you can no longer pretend that it matters. You're at the family lunch and feel an abysmal distance between you and the people. You're doing things that used to give pleasure, and now everything seems covered by a layer of ash, emptied of substance, without taste, without color, without life. Kafka experienced this in a lacerating way, mainly in the bureaucratic work he deeply hated but needed to maintain for some financial independence. He described his afternoons at the insurance office as slow death, as being ground by an invisible machine that transformed his life into useless paperwork, meaningless stamps, absurd procedures that led nowhere. And at night, when he finally had time to write, to do the only thing that really mattered to him, he was so exhausted, so shattered inside, that he could barely begin. He wrote to his friend Milena Jasenska that he felt like someone living in a prison where the walls were invisible but absolutely insurmountable, where every gesture of freedom was immediately punished by inexplicable guilt, where every attempt to live authentically ran into incomprehensible obstacles. Kafka's relationship with Felice Bauer, to whom he was engaged twice, perfectly illustrates this tearing apart. He wanted to marry because that's what a man should do, but he knew marriage would destroy his inner life, his need for solitude to write, his essentially different nature. So he was trapped between the desire to meet expectations and the need to preserve his authenticity, and this division tore him apart. If you're feeling that you can no longer live the life you built, that there's a fundamental incompatibility between who you are and how you're living, you're experiencing exactly what Kafka called the impossibility of living, this sensation of being trapped in an existence that rejects everything essential in you. The second thing Kafka discovered, and which explains why this loss of meaning is so devastating, is that you're not just losing the meaning of some areas of your life, you're losing the meaning of the entire structure upon which you built your identity, the entire narrative you believed about who you were and where you were going. Kafka wrote The Trial, his most disturbing work, exactly about this. Joseph K. is arrested without knowing why, accused of a crime that's never revealed, dragged through an absurd judicial system where nobody explains the rules, nobody clarifies the accusation, nobody offers possible defense, and Kafka's genius is in showing that Joseph K. isn't innocent trying to prove his innocence. He's someone who was caught by the system and now needs to discover what his crime is, needs to understand what he's being accused of, but this understanding never comes. What Kafka is revealing is that we all live under an invisible tribunal, a system of constant judgment that we've internalized since childhood, where we're permanently guilty of not being enough, of not measuring up, of not being up to par, but we never know exactly what we're guilty of. We never have access to the real accusation. When the meaning of life crumbles, what's really happening is that you finally realized you spent your whole life trying to defend yourself from accusations that were never made explicit, trying to prove your worth in a tribunal that never stops judging, but never reveals the judgment criteria. You built an entire life based on trying to be innocent, trying to measure up, trying to fit in. But now you realize that no matter how much you try, the verdict was already given from the start. You were already condemned before you even began. And the cruelest part is that you internalized this tribunal. You became your own accuser, prosecutor, and judge, reproducing inside yourself the oppressive system that should be outside. Kafka showed that the real prison isn't external bars. It's the bars you build inside your own mind. The invisible rules you follow without questioning. The inexplicable guilt you carry without knowing why. When you lose the meaning of life, it's not because life has no meaning. It's because you finally saw the absurdity of the system in which you were trapped, finally realized the game was rigged from the beginning, that there was no possible victory, that your entire struggle was against an invisible enemy, that you yourself fed. One of Kafka's greatest scholars, Walter Benjamin, said something profound that perfectly explains why so many people recognize themselves in Kafkaesque work. Kafka describes the modern condition of being permanently in transit, of never arriving anywhere, of living in an infinite wait for something that never materializes. Benjamin realized that Kafka's characters are always trying to reach something, enter somewhere, be accepted by some authority, but always run into invisible obstacles, doors that never open, permissions that are never granted. And this resonates so deeply because it's exactly how you feel now, in permanent waiting, postponing real life for when you finally manage to reach that position, that status, that recognition. But each achievement only reveals another closed door, another step to climb, another test to pass. A Kafka reader named Milena, who was one of the great passions of his life, described Franz as someone who lived in a state of permanent wounding, as if existence itself were an open wound that never healed, and she saw in every word he wrote the desperate attempt to name a pain that had no name, to explain a suffering that was too deep for ordinary words. Milena understood that Kafka wasn't being dramatic or exaggerated. He was being absolutely precise in describing a type of psychological suffering that most people don't recognize as legitimate, a suffering that has no clear external cause but is as real and devastating as any physical pain. Max Brod, Kafka's best friend and responsible for publishing his works after his death against Kafka's own instructions, said that Franz had such an acute sensitivity to the absurdity of existence that it was as if he could see the reality behind reality, perceive the hidden mechanisms that keep the world functioning, but that most people never question. And Brod realized that this ability to see beyond made it impossible for Kafka to live normally, because once you see the machine behind the curtain, once you perceive the fundamental absurdity of the social structures that should give meaning to life, you can no longer pretend you don't see. You can no longer participate innocently in the collective theater. If you're living through this loss of meaning, you're part of a lineage of people that Kafka masterfully represented, people whose sensitivity to the absurd and whose need for authenticity make ordinary life impossible, make it impossible to accept ready-made scripts without questioning. Here's the third layer of this truth, the deepest and potentially most liberating. Kafka discovered that when meaning completely collapses, when you lose all external references, when even your constructed identity crumbles, you finally have access to something that was hidden under all those layers of conditioning, under all those social masks, under all those roles you were playing. In The Castle, his last unfinished novel, Kafka tells the story of Kay, a land surveyor who arrives at a village to work at the castle that dominates the region, but never manages to enter the castle, never manages to speak with the authorities, never even manages to confirm that he was really called to work there. Kay spends the entire book trying to prove he has the right to be there, that he was summoned, that he has a legitimate purpose, but his entire quest is futile. He never reaches the castle, never receives confirmation, never finds his place. And Kafka is revealing something transcendent. The castle represents everything you think you need to reach to finally feel valid, complete, deserving of being alive. But the truth is the castle is unattainable by design. It exists precisely to keep you in permanent search, to make you believe your value is out there, in some external approval, in some future achievement, in some recognition that will come when you're finally enough. The collapse of meaning you're living through now is the moment when you finally realize the castle was never going to open, that the search was infinite, that you were chasing something that was designed to be unattainable. And this, however devastating it may seem, is actually the portal to something completely different. Kafka wrote in his diaries that only when you completely give up trying to reach external recognition, only when you stop seeking validation in the world, only when you accept that you'll never completely measure up to what's expected, can you finally begin to discover who you really are underneath all those layers of conditioning. The loss of meaning isn't the end. It's the necessary death of a false identity. It's the collapse of an inauthentic structure that needed to fall so something true could emerge. Kafka lived through this psychological death repeatedly, and each time he emerged with a deeper understanding that true meaning isn't in meeting external expectations, isn't in reaching the goals that society values, isn't in being accepted by the castle, but rather in developing an authentic relationship with your own existence, with your own contradictions, with your own estrangement from the world. The psychological mechanism behind this loss of meaning that Kafka mapped so precisely works like this. Since childhood, you're taught that there's a right path, a correct way to live, a set of milestones that define a successful life, and you internalize these criteria as if they were absolute truths, instead of arbitrary social constructions. You learn that you need to be productive, successful, socially accepted, emotionally stable, physically attractive, intellectually competent, and all your vital energy is channeled into trying to meet these standards. Kafka wrote repeatedly in his letters and diaries about what he called the inner tribunal, this relentless internal voice that constantly judges, criticizes, points out your inadequacies, compares you with others, is never satisfied with anything you do. He realized this voice wasn't really his. It was the internalization of all external expectations, mainly the voice of the domineering father, but also the voice of society, of culture, of all the value systems he passively absorbed. And this inner tribunal creates a state of constant alert, permanent vigilance over yourself, where you can never relax, never simply be, because you're always being monitored, always being evaluated, always being judged as insufficient. Kafka described this experience as having a black bird permanently perched on his shoulder, pecking at his head without stopping, whispering incessant criticisms, pointing out every flaw, magnifying every mistake. Over time, this pressure becomes unsustainable, but you can't simply turn off the tribunal, can't simply silence the critical voice, because it's woven into the structure of your identity. So what happens is that your psychological organism eventually collapses under the weight. Your ability to keep pretending you're functioning simply exhausts itself, and you enter this state of loss of meaning where nothing matters anymore, because you finally realized you could never satisfy the tribunal, would never be enough, would never be up to par. Kafka understood that this collapse isn't failure. It's actually the moment when your authentic being finally manages to make itself heard underneath all the internalized voices. It's when the part of you that always knew that path was false finally gets strong enough to interrupt the farce, to say enough, to refuse to continue. What Kafka lived and documented wasn't the individual peculiarity of a neurotic and difficult man. It was the precise mapping of a universal condition of modern human existence, especially intensified in the 20th and 21st centuries, where we all live under the weight of impossible expectations, under the constant surveillance of real and imaginary gazes, under the pressure to perform acceptable versions of ourselves. You feel exactly what Kafka felt because you live in the same structure he mapped. You're trapped in the same contradictions he identified. You fight against the same invisible tribunals he described. When Kafka wrote about the impossibility of living, about being trapped in situations with no way out, about trying to meet contradictory expectations, he wasn't just talking about himself. He was revealing something about all of us, about the fundamental structure of how modern society operates on the individual psyche. Think about how many times you felt you were living for others, fulfilling expectations that weren't yours, pursuing goals you don't even know if you really want, maintaining relationships because it's expected, working at something that empties your soul because you need to pay bills, smiling when you're crumbling inside because vulnerability is weakness. All these patterns are exactly what Kafka was describing when he talked about living under the trial. This permanent judgment, where you're simultaneously defendant, prosecutor, and judge of yourself. And the universality of the Kafkaesque experience explains why his works resonate so deeply decades after his death. Why people from completely different cultures immediately recognize what he's describing. Why you're watching this video now feeling that finally someone is naming what you live, but couldn't explain. Kafka didn't create these psychological mechanisms. He revealed them. He made them visible through his absurd narratives that are actually absolutely realistic about the internal functioning of modern consciousness. When you lose the meaning of life, when everything crumbles, when you can no longer function as expected, you're going through the same crisis that Kafka went through repeatedly, the same crisis that all his characters go through, the same crisis that is actually a portal to a completely different way of existing that no longer depends on external validation. That's no longer based on meeting impossible expectations, that no longer needs the castle's recognition to feel legitimate. Kafka discovered something absolutely crucial about how to cross this existential desert without getting completely lost. You don't get out of this crisis by finding a new, ready-made meaning to replace the old one. You get out of it by developing a completely different relationship with the very idea of meaning, learning to live in uncertainty, in contradiction, in not knowing, without needing to resolve everything, without needing to have all the answers, without needing to meet some ideal. In his diaries, Kafka wrote that he finally understood his task wasn't to become a different person, stronger, more adapted, more normal. His task was to deeply accept who he really was, including everything in him that was strange, inadequate, different, impossible to fit into available social categories. He realized that the struggle to become acceptable was what was destroying him, that each attempt to conform only increased the distance between his true being and his lived life. The path Kafka mapped isn't a path of self-improvement, of personal development, of becoming a better version of yourself according to external criteria. It's a path of radical acceptance of what is, of stopping fighting against your own nature, of giving up on reaching the castle and finally beginning to actually live. This doesn't mean passive resignation or giving up on life. It means exactly the opposite. It means finally beginning to truly live because you're no longer spending all your energy trying to be someone you're not. Kafka wrote that when he finally accepted he would never be the man his father wanted, would never be the conventional husband Felice expected, would never be the exemplary employee the insurance company desired, he experienced a strange freedom, painful but deeply real, the freedom to simply be what he was without apologizing. And this acceptance didn't happen all at once. It wasn't sudden enlightenment. It was a slow, painful process, full of relapses, where he constantly oscillated between trying to conform again and accepting his fundamental difference. What you're living through now, this loss of meaning that seems devastating, is actually the beginning of this liberation process. It's your authentic being finally strong enough to reject the imposed script, to say, I won't pretend anymore. I can't anymore. I don't want to anymore. And Kafka is showing you that on the other side of this psychological death, there isn't another ready-made script waiting for you. There's something much more precious. There's the possibility of building a life that's genuinely yours, that reflects who you really are, that doesn't need the castle's approval to be valid. So let's recap the 3 layers of truth that Kafka revealed about this devastating experience of losing the meaning of life. First, you didn't lose the meaning of life itself. You lost the meaning of a life that was never really yours, built on internalized expectations and social roles you were playing, but that denied who you essentially are. Second, this collapse of meaning happens because you finally realized the fundamental absurdity of the system in which you were trapped. This invisible tribunal that permanently judged you, without ever revealing the accusations. This infinite search for the castle that was designed to be unattainable, and your psychological organism simply can no longer sustain the farce. Third, and most important, this psychological death isn't the end, but rather the necessary portal to a completely different way of existing, where you can finally stop trying to meet the impossible and begin to develop an authentic relationship with your own life, your own contradictions, your own estrangement from the world. Kafka lived through this transformation painfully, documented every stage with surgical precision, and left a map for all of us who are crossing the same existential desert. What you're feeling now isn't pathology, isn't weakness, isn't personal failure. It's actually a sign that you're evolving beyond the structures that kept you trapped. It's evidence that something in you refuses to continue living inauthentically. It's the beginning of a metamorphosis that will take you to a place you can't yet imagine, but that Kafka promised exists on the other side. Yes, it's painful. Yes, it's scary. Yes, you'll feel completely lost for a while. But Kafka is showing you that this loss is necessary, that you can't build something new without first letting the old completely crumble, that you can't discover who you really are while you're still trying to be who you should be. And the hope Kafka offers isn't cheap hope that everything will magically be fine. It's much deeper and more real hope that on the other side of this crossing you can finally find a way to live that's genuine, that's yours, that doesn't depend on the approval of invisible tribunals, that doesn't need the castle's recognition, that doesn't require you to betray yourself to be accepted. You made it to the end of this video, and that already says something important about who you are. You're not someone who settles for superficial answers. You can no longer accept shallow explanations for profound experiences. You're seeking something true in a world full of fakes. The fact that Kafka's work resonates with you, the fact that you recognize your own experience in these descriptions, means you're part of a specific group of people that Kafka called those who cannot live normally, those who feel too deeply, those who see beyond social masks, those who need authenticity even when it's painful, even when it complicates everything, even when it would be much easier to simply conform. You're exactly the type of person Kafka wrote for, that he tried to reach through his works, that he wanted to help understand they're not alone in this experience of fundamental estrangement from the world. And it's exactly for people like you that I created this channel, to translate Kafka and other deep thinkers into accessible language but without losing the depth, to map these psychological territories that most ignore, but that you need to understand, to make sense of your own experience. Every week I bring new videos exploring Kafka-esque themes, unraveling the psychological mechanisms he identified, offering perspectives that will help you name what you feel but couldn't explain, to understand why you are the way you are, to find company in this solitary journey of searching for authenticity. Subscribing to the channel isn't just clicking a button. It's making a conscious decision not to go through this metamorphosis alone, to have regular access to content that helps you make sense of what you're living through, to belong to a community of people who understand because they're also going through this, to say yes to your own transformation, even without knowing exactly where it will take you. You'll gain understanding about the mechanisms that trap you. You'll learn to recognize the invisible tribunals that judge you. You'll discover that what you thought was a defect might actually be sensitivity necessary for an authentic life. You'll find validation for experiences that nobody around you seems to understand. This channel is a safe space for those who are waking up, for those who are questioning, for those who are feeling displaced precisely because they're evolving beyond the structures that keep most people asleep. So subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss any video, because each video is a piece of the map Kafka left for us. Each exploration is one more step in the journey of self-understanding that you've already begun by getting here. And don't stop now. There's a video on the screen that's a natural continuation of this journey that will deepen your understanding even more about what Kafka revealed about the modern human condition. So click on it and continue this transformation that's already begun.